Welcome, everybody. My name is Jim Leap. I'm a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment, and I'll serve as the chair of this defense. I want to welcome you on behalf of the Emmett Interdisciplinary Program on Environment and Resources. We're here for the dissertation defense of Kelley McKanna. Her dissertation focus was the impact of identity, situation, and action framing on environmental behavior. Before we turn to her, let me introduce the members of her committee. First, her two lead advisors, Gabrielle Wong-Parodi, who is an assistant professor of Earth System Science at Stanford and a Woods fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. And the other lead advisor, Dale Miller, who was the class of 1968 and the Ed Xiao Professor of Organizational Behavior at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. Also serving as members of the dissertation reading committee are J.R. DeShazo, who is Professor of Public Affairs and Dean of the J School of Public Affairs at the University of Texas in Austin, and Bruce Kane, Professor of Political Science at Stanford, Director of the Bill Lane Center for the American West, and a Senior Fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment, the Precourt Center Institute for Energy, and the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. So quite a great committee for this session. We will, as you know, hear first from Kelley, who will present the findings of her research. There will be time for Q&A at the end. Since we're all virtual, you can either submit your question in the Q&A box and I will read it aloud, or you can raise your hand with the raise hand feature and I will call on you to offer your question directly. More on that when we get back to Q&A. But now let me turn it over to Gabrielle Wong-Parodi to introduce Kelley.
Great, thank you so much, Jim. So I have the pleasure and honor of introducing Kelley McKanna this morning, who'll be sharing some of the work that she has been doing during her time at Stanford. And I have known Kelley since nearly my first day at Stanford back in 2019. And I have this very vivid and wonderful memory of us having a conversation about streak incentives and for peak time electricity use and conservation behavior. I have very clear memories of this and kind of just hand gestures of like streaks. And I was like, oh my gosh, this research is so cool. And it just made me feel so excited to be at Stanford and to be able to work with Kelley. And so it was such a great conversation. It ultimately led to many more conversations, including the research that Kelley is going to talk about today. So before coming to Stanford, Kelley earned a BA in Environmental Economics and Policy from UC Berkeley. She then spent some years at Renew Financial as a project manager working on local clean energy finance. She then went on to UCLA to earn a Master's of Public Policy, after which we were lucky enough to have her decide to join us at E-IPER, where she has worked on projects ranging from streak incentives and conservation behavior to testing the effect of an evidence-based identity intervention on policymaker beliefs about topics from renewables to energy efficiency. In addition to the amazing work that Kelley has done at Stanford, she is also a tremendously conscientious and extremely generous person. She's willing to talk through analytical design issues or analysis issues with other students who are grappling with issues with kind of their research. And she provides very respectful and extremely insightful and constructive feedback. It's been a delight working with and getting to know Kelley over the years. And I know that she's going to do amazing things in the years to come. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Kelley.
Thank you. One second while I get this up. I don't know why I just lost this. But thank you so much for that introduction, Gabrielle. Let me share my screen. All right, thank you. I'm hoping this all looks right. So thank you both, Jim and Gabrielle, for your introductions. I'm excited to talk to everyone today about my dissertation research on the impact of identity, situation, and action framing on environmental behavior. So this work is inspired by March and Olson's logic of appropriateness. So March and Olson proposed a logic of appropriateness as an alternative to the logic of consequences, which is what a lot of us have thought about as we thought about public policies. The logic of consequences is an idea that individuals are guided by the costs and benefits of a given action. And that's often how we design policy, is to adjust those costs and benefits. But the logic of appropriateness gives us another lens to look at behavior, which is that people are often looking to figure out how one ought to behave in a situation was appropriate. And the way that individuals often make that decision is that they ask themselves either explicitly or implicitly, what does a person like me do in a situation like this? And so that question inherently has three different dimensions. Who is a person like me? What is a situation like this? What am I thinking about when I think about doing something? And what are the rules and heuristics I use around that behavior? And so there are fixed characteristics of the individuals in situation that are hard to change, but there is also a lot of malleability to how people conceptualize their identity, their situation categorization. And those can often be shaped by cues, framing, choice architecture. And so I think that there is a lot of interesting ways to design interventions around how people make sense of these different characteristics. And so I think it's often easier to think through these things with an example. And so here's an example that I have found myself in, is arriving at the farmer's market and trying to figure out what is appropriate masking behavior. So imagine this person has entered the market. Some people are masked, some people aren't masked. And they might have multiple identities that could be at play. They might think of themselves as low risk. They also might think of themselves as a rule follower. Similarly, situation has different levels at which you can think of something. The event is outdoors. It's also a crowded space full of people who are not in your household, of different risk profiles. And so then the question is also then how are you thinking of the action? Is the decision a binary question about whether or not to wear a mask, in which case that mask could be a cloth mask or it could be a 95? Or someone thinking about the question they're trying to answer is how do they minimize exposure, in which case they're worrying about mask fit, mask type, what have you. And so these are all, this kind of highlights the idea that there are kind of things you can't change about the situation, but there are also changes in how people can conceptualize these different factors. So my dissertation work tracks onto these three elements. In the first chapter, I am kind of investigating how cues can change how individuals think about their identity and the identities which are active, and how that can then increase or decrease belief updating, the idea of whether or not people change their mind when encountering new evidence. The second chapter pivots to thinking about situation. So I'm thinking specifically about how the structure of incentives change the way that individuals make sense of their social context, and how that then might affect relevant environmental behaviors like the adoption of rooftop solar. And then lastly, in the third chapter, I started thinking about how individuals conceptualize actions. And we kind of explore these questions, looking at how features of incentive design might change how people think about electricity conservation actions during a peak time electricity program. So to jump in the first chapter, we're thinking about how cues can change the perceptions of identity and then change behavior. And so the problem that we are responding to with this work, and this is work that I did with Professor Wong-Parodi, is it's hard to change your mind. And I think that's pretty intuitive to a lot of people. And it can be harder to change your mind when evidence that you encounter challenges your political beliefs, specifically the beliefs of your political party. And that behavioral tendency has a lot of important ramifications, but one that I think is particularly interesting is that it might blunt the impact of evidence-based policymaking. So if policymakers underreact to evidence, we're going to inhibit our ability to use that evidence to design more effective policies. So then the research question is there a way to shift around the identities to make individuals more willing to change their mind when they encounter this party challenging evidence? So we specifically, this is built upon the insight, hypothesized that maybe policymakers thought themselves as evidence-based. And when you bring that identity to the fore and they're thinking themselves as evidence-based, maybe they're more willing to change their mind, even when the information challenges a political party, because changing one's mind all of a sudden is consistent with your identity, that you're evidence-based and that you change your mind when you encounter new evidence. And so we're testing these ideas using two surveys of actual policymakers in the US. So the first survey uses state legislators, and the second is a survey of local policymakers in the US. So then the question is, how do we activate an identity? What is the cue that we're talking about? So in these surveys, the identity activation treatment is we ask people to read a description of what evidence-based policy is, what the benefits are, and then we also give them a little bit more information about bipartisan support, high-level bipartisan support for evidence-based policymaking among both Republicans and Democrats. And then we ask them whether they would describe themselves as a supporter of evidence-based policymaking. And we find that overwhelmingly, across both parties, individuals almost entirely will identify as a supporter of evidence-based policymaking. And then just to make sure that we really reinforce the treatment, we ask those participants to think about a time when they use evidence to either make up their mind or change their mind about policy. What was that policy and why was that important to use evidence? So in order to identify the effect of this intervention, we structure the experiment as we randomize the treatment. So half participants will receive a control, other half will receive the identity treatment that we just went through. And then we go about trying to measure the phenomena of people changing their mind in new evidence. So first, we describe a policy, a specific policy. We use 3 different policies throughout the experiment. And then we ask them whether or not that policy will have a negative to positive impact. And we ask them to rate that impact on like a scale of 1 to 7. And then after that, we present them evidence that may or may not challenge their prior beliefs about that policy. And so then we conduct the same measure of beliefs again. So we can ask them how positive or negative impact would this policy have on your community. And that difference between the belief in step 2, pre-information, and the belief in step 4, post-information, is what we use as the measure of belief updating. So whether or not they change their position. Our hypothesis is that the identity treatment will increase updating, so change the beliefs about the policy's impact among the political party that we expect to find the information challenging, because that's the group in which we expect there to be otherwise inhibition of updating. So we again test this in 3 different policy scenarios. The first one is we use in the first survey of state legislators. And the policy that we're looking at is opportunity zones. So opportunity zones is a policy in which the federal government provides a tax break for corporations that invest in low income areas. But we present evidence that suggests that the expected benefits are not always observed among those communities that are living in those areas. And that's to challenge the beliefs that this is an effective policy at improving outcomes. So when we look at the prior beliefs, we find that overwhelmingly Republicans anticipate these policies will have positive impacts. And we also see that in the absence of the treatment, that Republicans appear to be skeptical of the information that is presented to them that challenges their prior beliefs. So looking at the graph, we're able to look at the effects of the identity activation on belief updating. And so we see that among Republicans, that updating does increase in the treatment condition relative to the control, and that effect is significant. So this is support for our hypothesis that we can increase updating by using this identity activation treatment. So moving to study 2A, which again, this is among local policymakers in the US. We pivot to a different policy domain, which is about the impact of energy efficiency rebates, specifically for households. And so the evidence that we present to policymakers is evidence that relative to other energy efficiency programs, providing these residential rebates is relatively low in terms of cost effectiveness. And that challenges the priorities of Democrats. Most Democrats believe that these policies will have a positive impact. And those Democrats are also skeptical of the information that says that the cost effectiveness of these programs is low relative to other options. And when we look at the effects on updating in the graph, we again see that the treatment appears to increase updating among Democrats specifically relative to those in the control condition. So this is looking pretty consistent so far. And the dreaded study 2B complicates things a bit. So we see that in this third scenario, this is again with local policymakers, we investigate the policy scenario where local policymakers are considering a policy that would increase renewable energy generation. And the evidence we present is that renewable energy generation can be increased without necessarily increasing the cost of electricity. Prior to receiving that evidence, most Republicans believe that the renewable energy policy will have a negative impact on their community, and are skeptical of the information that suggests that that renewable energy generation could be increased without increasing rates. And we do not actually observe in this study the same effect, that we have a significant increase in updating among the treated relative to controlled Republicans. So we have some thoughts about why it might be a little bit different in this domain. I'm happy to talk about that in Q&A. But all in all, the takeaway suggests that activating evidence-based identity does show some promise in overcoming partisan resistance to new information. And importantly, we did show that the intervention can be effective among both Democrats and Republicans, that the identity does not seem to be one which is limited to one party or the other, which is encouraging. However, this is early work, and there are a lot more follow-up questions that we would love to investigate in the future. But so as of now, we don't know which characteristics or conditions might limit the impact. So we don't know in what policy domains or among what individuals this might work better or worse as an intervention. We don't know how long-lasting these effects are. And we also don't know in the field how large of an impact this would have on like meaningful policymaking behaviors in terms of, for instance, voting on legislation. There are a lot of incentives at work in policymaking, and we don't know whether this would move the needle in a meaningful way. So moving away from identity and investigating the role of investigating this real situation, Gabrielle and I again looked at, or in this case, we looked at the effect of incentive design or the choice of what incentives are used and how that changes how individuals think about the situation that they're in. So there's been some old theorizing and some recent empirical work that suggests that incentives may act as a signal of information. Specifically, they might be a signal about institutional beliefs, and then also they might be a signal about peer values. So it might tell you a little bit about what is valued in your community, what other people in your community are doing. And this work also suggests that the signal that is that's communicated by the incentive might differ based upon how that incentive is designed. Most of this work looks at the difference between bonus versus fees, or what is often called like a carrot versus stick incentives, and how those communicate different information to individuals. So our research question is, there are a lot of different ways that local governments, state governments, utilities in the US structure solar incentives, and we wanted to see whether or not these different incentive structures had a different effect on consumer interest in rooftop solar due to framing as a part to the underlying financial effects of incentivizing the solar system. And so our approach was, again, we used a survey experiment, and this survey experiment the participants are representative participants in US coastal regions, which represent a pretty good variation of areas that have different types of solar incentives already, what have you. So we're looking at two different dimensions of incentives. So first, if we look at just the first line of this graph, we're looking at the investment incentives. So these are incentives that are given to people for adoption, and they're generally calculated based upon the size of the system. So the idea is like if you were to receive like a 30% rebate, which is one way to structure. And so those we're calling investment incentives, and comparing those to production incentives, which are incentives that are structured so that they reward the production of the solar system. So individuals are often rewarded for each kilowatt hour produced by the system. And this is often referred to as a feed-in tariff in solar policy. So that's one dimension of difference, which could potentially act as a signal. And then the other dimension that we're looking at, which is more well-studied, is this difference between among production incentives. It can be structured as a bonus, so a reward for each kilowatt hour generated, or as a stick. So we're imagining a world in which individuals are facing a per kilowatt hour tax, but are exempted if they install solar. So this is a very busy slide that gives you an idea of what participants saw in the survey. And so we, again, randomly assign individuals 2 conditions in our survey. And so we give them a control where we talk to them about which we describe solar as having gotten cheaper. So we say, oh, like over the last 5 years, the cost of rooftop solar has come down by $3,500. And we structure it this way just to try to make it as parallel as possible to the investment incentive. And so in the investment incentive condition, participants read about the offer where the state has made solar cheaper and they are providing a $3,500 incentive. The language gets a little different when we go to the production bonus by nature of the type of incentive. So we talk about the state is making electricity cheaper for homes with solar and is paying homeowners for every 3 cents for every kilowatt hour. The fee exemption is flipped, where we say the state is making electricity more expensive, but you can avoid when you charge. And it describes a scenario in which they're paying a 3-cent fee, but are exempted if they install rooftop solar. The really important dynamic is that the cost of those installations is described in the same way across all 4 conditions. So we say that the total cost for a home like theirs would be about $12,000, and inclusive of the incentives, they would save $1,000 per year over the next 25 years. And we reinforce these underlying financial conditions using the attention check or attention comprehension checks to make sure that individuals understand the costs and savings associated with the system and that they are the same across conditions. So we're looking at several different treatments, but so our first hypothesis is that the presence of an incentive relative to the control will increase attractiveness of the solar offer that they are seeing, because the fact that there is an incentive signals that installing solar is something which is valued by their community or the state. So when we look at the evidence, we find that the effects are actually diverge based upon the design of the incentive. So we see that the investment incentive is less attractive than the equivalently priced control. The production bonus is more attractive than the control, and the fee exemption doesn't seem to have an impact relative to the control. So we'll dig into the dynamics that might be underlying this as we move into our second hypothesis. So the second hypothesis is that the investment and production incentives might have different levels of impacts on attractiveness. The literature kind of advances several different reasons why these might be different without a really clear prediction of what will be more effective. So there is work that suggests that high incentives might signal that underlying adoption is low, because the assumption is that the state wouldn't introduce this incentive if adoption was already high, in which case the investment incentives might be less effective than the production incentive. However, there's also a good amount of work on a pennies a day effect, which shows that when you disaggregate something, it's called a pennies a day effect because they often talk about it's easier to get people to donate to things if you talk to them about the cost being pennies a day as opposed to a large upfront cost. So when you disaggregate payments, it often can cause something to look smaller. And so it's possible that any signal effect is diminished in the production incentive scenario. So looking at this, we see that fairly clearly the investment incentive is less effective in increasing attractiveness relative to the production incentive. And so then we use a mediation analysis to try to tease out what might be going here and whether that is in line with our prior thoughts based on the literature. And so we look at a range of potential mediators, all of which have been shown to be potentially affected by incentives, and also which have all been shown to affect either adoption or intentions to adopt solar. We'll focus on norms. So norm is perceptions about what other people are doing and how common a behavior is. And warm glow prediction is, we measure this by asking the question, how good would you feel about yourself if you were to say yes to this offer and to adopt solar? So this is the idea of like how virtuous people would feel and the positive affect or emotions associated with adoption. And we also look at other factors like environmental impact, perceived morality, perceived expense, but we'll focus on norms in this first slide. So this is a structural equation model where we look at how the investment incentive affects the proposed mediators, and then also in turn how those proposed mediators affect attractiveness. And we show that, or we find that the investment incentive has a significant effect on perceived norms. So specifically, it causes people who are taking the survey to believe that adoption of solar is less common. And in turn, that perception that is less common is associated with a lower rating of attractiveness. And we look at the structural equation model, we can essentially fully explain the effects of the incentive by the effects on norms. So this is in line with kind of the early theoretical work by Sluka and others. It's just that potentially the investment incentive is a signal that adoption is low. This is something that we need to pay you to do. On the other hand, when we look at the effects of the production bonus relative to the control, we don't see the same norm inferences. So individuals don't assume that peer adoption is low because the production is being incentivized. However, their inferences do change in terms of warm glow. So individuals in the condition that sees the incentive framed as a production bonus are more likely to think that they're going to feel good about themselves, that they're going to have this like warm glow, positive affect, pride associated with adopting solar, and that warm glow is associated with greater attractiveness. And again, that relationship can explain the effects of production bonus on attractiveness. So our third hypothesis is looking at differences between the production bonus and the fee exemption. And so we hypothesize that these will have differential impacts on attractiveness. And there is a decent amount, or there is strong evidence that in other domains, specifically this has been looked at in kind of low cost domains, like bringing a reusable grocery bag or bringing a reusable mug to the cafe. But there has been evidence that a fee rather than a bonus, so the stick rather than the carrot, is more effective in changing behavior because it increases moralization. It increases the perception that this behavior is very common, and that it increases negative emotions associated with not doing the action, like guilt or shame. And so as a result, fees have been shown to be more effective than bonuses in changing these behaviors. If that is the case, we would, in this scenario, we would expect to see the fee have a larger impact. But we also hypothesize, or we speculate, that participants may resist casting adoption as a moral obligation. So the way that it works with Bring Your Bags, that people believe that everyone brings their bags, it's expected, and you should feel bad about not bringing your bags. But it's hard to believe that individuals would see adopting solar, which is pretty rare and quite expensive, as being an obligation. So individuals might resist that moralization or recasting as an obligation. And so what we see is that, at least in this domain, contrary to the rest of the literature, we don't see a larger impact of fee versus the bonus. In fact, the production bonus seems to be a little bit more effective than the fee exemption scenario, suggesting that there might be domain-specific effects that predict when fees versus bonuses are the more effective policy tool. So our takeaway is that incentives do appear to be able to act as signals of situation characteristics, and that those signals could affect adoption, and that signal is sensitive to instrument type. We see that investment incentives can change descriptions or perceptions of descriptive norms. The production incentives can increase predictions of warm glow, and that the relative efficacy of carrots and sticks might depend upon policy context. Again, this is kind of early stage work that generates almost more questions than answers. And we see that, so we still don't know, we don't understand the range of contextual and individual factors that might affect these dynamics. We don't know whether or not Other messaging around incentives might diminish these impacts. For instance, if individuals receive information that solar adoption is very common, maybe that would overcome the effects of the investment incentive. And we also don't know how large these effects are relative to like a change in the size of the incentive. So it's possible that these aren't large effects that have a meaningful effect on adoption, but we just don't know at this point without testing these kind of things in the field. All right, so lastly, I want to talk about thinking a little bit about how individuals think about the action. And this work focuses on individual conservation during critical peak price events. So many utilities are trying to find ways to reduce demand during periods, these critical peak periods. These are periods when demand is very high, supply is low, and the value of reducing consumption is high to the utility. And so one way to do that is to deliver incentives for conservation. And this has been done in different sectors. We specifically are looking at a program which incentivizes conservation among households. And the problem that you kind of find arising out of the literature is that households appear to be sensitive to the presence of an incentive, but pretty insensitive to the level of that incentive. So there's work by Gillian in 2017, which shows that in a very similar program, similar timescale, similar participants, the individuals conserve roughly 11% when the price increases by 30%. Then when you increase the price by about 1,800%, the amount of conservation you get is about 13%. So it's relatively inelastic. And a lot of the literature has attributed this dynamic to low attention, that these incentives are not overall that large, so individuals are just not paying a lot of attention to the changing incentive. And so then our research question is, are households attentive to marginal incentives under a gamified nonlinear incentive? So are there dynamics about design which can increase this attention and responsiveness? And so unlike my prior work, this uses an observational data set from this residential demand response program. And we use a sorting analysis to see if individuals are sensitive to the features of the nonlinear incentive. This is, as Gabrielle said, I think earlier, we're talking about streaks. It's always a little bit complicated to explain this program, so bear with me. But so we have data from a program where individuals are often asked to save electricity during one specific hour of the day. So if you look to the right of the screen, you'll see an example of an SMS message that participants might get. So they'll say, on Tuesday from 7 to 8, we're asking you to conserve and we're rewarding you for conservation during that period. Individuals also get an alert the day of. And individuals are compensated for their conservation relative to their baseline. The baseline is calculated on their recent consumption during that same time period on non-weekend, non-holiday days. And they are paid roughly $1.50 per kilowatt hour that they save relative to that baseline. However, in addition to that base rate, individuals are also able to earn a bonus. And so the bonus is calculated based upon their streak. So what the streak is that every time an individual uses less electricity than their baseline, every time they beat their baseline, they receive one additional streak unit. And every streak unit earns them a 5% bonus on the base rate. So if they have a streak of 5, they're earning a 25% bonus over the base rate. They have a streak of 10, they're earning a 50% bonus. And then the moment that they exceed their baseline, the streak gets zeroed back out and they are earning just the base rate. So an individual that's attentive to incentives should be paying some attention to making sure they build the streak or maintain the streak. So our hypothesis is, if individuals are motivated to maintain their streak and possess sufficient control over their consumption, we would expect to see sorting relative to the baseline. So this would take the case of individuals will make sure that they use just a little bit less than the baseline so that they maintain their streak, because the incentives change discontinuously if they were to exceed it. The value of a streak is larger as it gets longer. So one might expect to see that sorting would be more pronounced when streaks are longer. So people are going to make sure they're more attentive to make sure they don't lose their streak of 10 relative to their streak of 2. And so the way that we evaluate this is using a histogram of observations. So the green bars are just observations from this data set. And the x-axis is shows how close people are to their baseline. So this is the difference between actual and baseline use. So anyone who has a negative value, so on the left side of the discontinuity, are people who are under their baseline and are going to build their streak in the next event. However, the moment that actual use exceeds baseline use, we'll see a positive value, and those are individuals who will lose their streak in the next event. So if individuals are paying attention and they want to maintain their streak, we expect to see this bunching on the left side. And in fact, we do see discontinuous sorting. And we measure this using the McCrary sorting test, which tests for discontinuous change in the density across the discontinuity. Like a little bit like a regression discontinuity, but where you're looking at density of observations with a histogram. And so somewhat surprisingly, we do see that individuals do seem to have enough control of their consumption and attention to the level of baselines to be sorting, to be controlling their assignment to the condition where they maintain their streak. And so to go back to our hypothesis, we thought that we might see more of this when streaks are longer, because the incentive to maintain the streak is larger. And so we bend streaks into different, we bend observations by their streak length. And so on the left, you see short streaks of 0 to 4. We still see significant levels of sorting, but that sorting does become more pronounced among medium streaks of length 5 to 9, and even more pronounced among longer streaks of 10 to 14. So this is consistent with individuals being responsive to the level of the marginal incentives that they are earning for themselves. So this suggests that individuals are taking efforts to make sure that they are maintaining a higher bonus for themselves, which will infect their earnings in the next event. So the takeaways from this is that at least a subset of participants are attentive to features of price, or to at least features of the information feedback environment. And they're adjusting their consumption. They're targeting their consumption in response to avoid losing their streak. Because this is an observational data set, we can't entirely rule out different explanations for this effect. So there are a couple different dynamics that could explain the findings. It's possible that there's something about the streak which is increasing the salience of changes in price. And so it's that presentation which is making individuals attentive to streak in this context, but not in others. It's also possible that individuals are motivated less by the change in the bonus and just by the streaks themselves. We see that streaks are often used in like habit forming or apps and presented without incentives. So there seems to at least be a lay theory that individuals want to keep building their streak, and that there's something reinforcing about that in itself. It's possible that this design makes the baseline very salient, and the individuals actually just want to make sure they don't exceed their baseline, that they derive some utility from succeeding in the event, independent of the bonus. Excited to conduct some future work to disentangle these different dimensions, but I think it is encouraging that there are aspects that the individual participants are somewhat attentive, and that once we understand what they are attentive to, we can design interventions which can kind of calibrate effort based upon different elements of that intervention design. So to wrap up, thank you for listening through all of these different elements. Again, so we've kind of looked at first that we can use prompts to activate latent identities change behavior. That the different incentive types might guide how individuals make sense of the situations, and that potentially incentive structure might change how individuals think about conservation, whether or not they're aiming to build streaks, whether they're aiming to maximize earnings, whether they're aiming to just be the baseline. I think that there is a lot of, I'm excited to do future work kind of expanding on all these elements in the area of identities. I'm excited to test the effects of evidence-based identities on legislative behavior in the field to see if it can move the needle. on meaningful actions taken by legislators. I'm also excited by the idea that we could explore alternate identities, like legislators' identities as a representative, to see if that can make them more responsive to information about constituent preferences and deal with some issues like the democratic deficit. In terms of situation, I am excited to test the effect of incentive designs across low and high cost behaviors to see in what domains which incentives are most effective in changing behavior, and to start trying to estimate the actual size of these effects and how big of an impact they have on like meaningful behaviors. And then lastly, very excited to disentangle what is going on with streak incentives, to investigate whether goals are tied to streak building or whether earning maximization, and to disentangle some of these effects of streaks and incentives, to design better interventions to encourage conservation in the field. And with that, I am excited to hear what people think and what questions you have. And thank you for your time.
Great. Thank you, Casey. Maybe we take it down from shared screen and we can see people.
Yes.
Fantastic. So you've given us a lot to think about and to talk about, I hope. So as a reminder, you can ask questions in two ways. You can type a question into the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, in which case I will read it aloud to Casey. Or you can use the raise hand function and I will call on you and you can ask the question directly. So don't be shy. Let's get into it. And we have till the top of the hour, and then I'll turn it back to Casey for closing remarks. So I have one initial question in the Q&A box from Madi Taragi. I hope that's how you pronounce your name. Number one, how many samples did you have for your SEM model? And two, why didn't you consider norm as a latent variable and you instead used a path analysis?
So in terms of observations, so each condition was roughly 250 individuals. So it was a sample size of the cross-form conditions of about 1,000 participants, a little bit more. And I conducted it as a, so I looked at a more classic mediation model with just those factors, and looking at structural equation model. Frankly, mediation and latent variable analysis is like a little bit newer to me. And so these were the pre-registered tests that we had said that we would run, and we bound our hands by that a little bit. But it would be interesting to try different ways of analyzing like latent variable analysis. That would be interesting to run in the future. That's a great idea.
Okay, next question from an anonymous attendee. Great presentation. I was wondering if you could elaborate on why we are seeing different effects on fees versus bonuses compared to what we've seen in different domains.
Mm-hmm. So most of the work that has been done on fees versus bonuses has been conducted with low cost behaviors, which are kind of on the cusp of being common. So we see work with specifically bringing a reusable bag and bringing a reusable mug. That's the empirical work that's been done. And I think that there is some work that suggests that that the reason why fees are effective is because they work by more like turning something which is, people think of as a, I really like to use the Miller-Monin typology of a moral opportunity, moral test here. So you've taken a behavior that people feel kind of good about. It's a moral opportunity. It's an opportunity for virtue, and you're turning it into something which people are expected to do. It's obligation, and the fee communicates that this is something which is expected. And I think that works really well if individuals think it's a reasonable thing to turn into a test. They think it's reasonable for that to be a moral obligation. And bringing a paper bag and bringing a paper bag, or I'm sorry, reusable bag, bringing a reusable cup are things that are kind of within that domain. I think that people might resist doing that for solar panels because it's quite expensive and it's quite rare. So it's really hard to convert that from something which is like an act of virtue to an expected moral obligation. So I think that's my intuition on why it is different in this domain. And so you also have some work by Evers et al. That shows that people often want to match kind of how they think about an action with the carrot versus stick. And so people generally want to use the fee when they think of something should be punished. I think that no one thinks that not adopting solar should be punished. It's just not, it's too expensive. And so I think that's kind of why we're seeing this dynamic, but I'm excited to test it specifically.
Great. From another anonymous attendee, why was there no stick option for investments? Is that not possible to do, or was it important for study design?
Me, I didn't do it because it didn't seem, even the stick for bonus feels a little bit, for lack of a better term, like a little far-fetched. It's hard to imagine, given the current political environment, a state saying that they're going to fine people for not installing solar. And so for me, like, it just is, we might, or the changes in effects could just be to like the novelty of the idea. And so it made sense to just test it again in the bonus or in the production domain, because it was more realistic. And then also it's one less cell you have to power with a sample.
I don't have another question on the screen, but Casey, in your first paper, I think it was the dreaded 2B, you said that you had some theories about what might explain the lack of effect in that case. You want to say a little bit about that?
Yeah, so these aren't, we don't have enough domains to start making like systematic conclusions, but it did strike me that this was the one domain where we were trying, so in the first two domains, we're essentially taking people who are supportive of policy and we're asking them to be skeptical of that policy. So we're asking them to withdraw support. And in the third condition, we're taking people who don't like a policy, who think that renewable energy, increasing renewable energy will have a negative impact on the community. And we're asking them to kind of then manifest support. We're trying to take them from like the negative to a supporter. And there is some evidence that policymakers are more attentive to like, they would rather not do bad things or not do unpopular things than to do good things. And so I think that trying to get Republicans to support renewable energy is pretty costly, as opposed to getting a Democrat not to support energy efficiency. So I think it might be easier to get people to withdraw their support from something that doesn't work than to build support for something which would work. But it's also possible that renewable energy is just more politically salient and an issue which is more likely to attract the ire of constituents. And so in that scenario, you might see that the policymakers don't want to believe in something that they believe will be very politically unpopular.
Last chance. Any other questions? I'm not seeing any in the raised hands or in the Q&A. Oh. Okay, Hajin, hold on a second. It's off my screen. So from Hajin Kim, read your answer on politician preferences. Does that suggest politicians care more about passing moral tests than seizing moral opportunities?
I think it does. I think that there is at least a sense that people are more attentive to risks than benefits. And I don't know if that is a rational impulse versus one which, maybe I don't want to say irrational, but like, I don't know if it, I think there is at least a sense that politicians would rather not have a negative campaign ad targeted against them than have one more like positive story to tell about something that they did. So there's this attention to negative and attention to risks.
Okay. No more questions? I don't see. So Casey, why don't we turn it back to you for
Great. I will go back to my slides. So I would like to thank everyone for attending. But I also want to take a little time to thank all the people who helped me through this work, this PhD. I wouldn't be able to do it without my large community of mentors and supporters and friends. So I'd like to thank all of my advisors, both those on the committee now, and then also Nick Save, Jim Sweeney, Charlotte Golstad, who have been advisors along the way. I'd like to thank the entire E-IPER family, which gives us so much support as we make our way through the program, to Anne-Marie, to Anjana, Gabby, Miley. And then also I have been really lucky to be a part of many different groups, which have been collaborators, sounding boards, teachers as I have developed projects. So thank you to the UCLA Luskin Center for Innovation, the Stanford Environment and Behavior Group, Wong-Parodi Lab, Miller Lab, and then my very much beloved cohort of wonderful women researchers. I have a great group of people who have been with me since day one working this program. So thank you, Andrea, Miyuki, Nina, Rachel, Sammy, Shannon, Sugata, and all of their partners and dogs and kids that have made this program fun and vibrant to be in. Also to my working group that has gotten us through lockdown and beyond, and who have listened to many iterations of this work and this presentation specifically. So thank you again to Sammy, Hodgin, Sarah, and Eleanor. And then lastly, my family. I'd like to thank my kids, Benji and Lyndon, who have been a great sense of perspective and inspirers of outside time. And to Dave, who has made this all possible, my husband. And yeah, thank you. Yes, thanks.
Okay, do you want to take it down then?
Yeah.
So thanks, Casey. I'm sorry that we're not all in person and can applaud as definitely we should, but congratulations on a great presentation.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you to everybody who came. I think you know how this works. The committee will now go into a closed session for the next couple of hours to talk further with Casey. Results will come out in an email from and then there will be a reception in person at 2:30 on the second floor of the Wong Terrace, the second floor terrace at Wong. So with that, committee will reconvene in 10 minutes. You have a separate link for that. We will see you then. And thanks everybody else for joining.